All right, so I want to set the stage for really what we're going to try and do in this workshop. And there's certain ethical dilemmas that I want to address. And I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, that new technologies confront us with new ethical dilemmas, but I want to deal with specific ones, yeah? So I wanted to take a couple of examples where the use of online social networking sites blurs between our political interest, our personal interest. In some way, the information that is posted on this site is taken and used for something else, not for what it was intended to be used for, right? So we have researchers right now that are looking at how you can learn more about the users on Twitter by following their actual posts. So now you can actually determine through the content of what people say, what their gender is, and also what their age is. And now researchers are looking at, can we combine these two, but can we also add something like gestures or smiles to learn even more about the individuals? So certainly, when you're posting tweets, that's not really what you're thinking of, that someone out there is trying to figure out what your gender is, what your age is, and then maybe use it for some other purpose, right? Or we have, stories like the one at the top where individuals are engaging in an activity online. And this activity, this like, something as simple as a like, has repercussions in their real world, in their non-virtual realities, yeah? So there was an example in Scotland where an individual clicked like and he was fired because the like was a comment that was derogatory towards his boss. Or this individual here, he believes that his boss found out that he was homosexual because he clicked like on a photo of a same-sex couple who were getting married, and he believes that he was fired because of this, yeah? And this was the Scotland story that I was talking about. So this idea that information that we are posting in a, air quotations, private sphere of our lives is being used in another sphere of our lives. Or if we take this even a step further, I would assume that I don't have to introduce the NSA or the Nsa Scandals to you all, but the idea that now government organizations want to use information that we're posting on social networking sites for their own purposes, whether or not that's getting a more well-rounded picture of the citizen or understanding their behaviors and their habits in a different way. And this was, of course, really popular a couple years ago with Snowden releasing what the NSA was actually doing. And the discourse after this inspired the image of a balance, right? A balance between security of the state and individual privacy. That in order to achieve this ideal of a secure state, you're going to have to balance this with your individual privacy. You're going to have to give up individual privacy. So I want to spend some time talking about this idea of balancing, because we should all understand that when you balance something, when you say that you're going to implement a security measure and you will minimize privacy in a certain setting, to balance that means you have to implement additional measures to realign privacy with security. Otherwise, what we're really talking about is not a balance at all, it's a trade-off. You're saying you're giving up privacy in order for the security of the state, yeah? So what are the ethical issues when talking about these contemporary examples? There's a variety of them. There's this concept of identity management. How does an individual have control over what information they share, how it's shared, when it's shared? Do they have the opportunity to correct it once it's been shared or before it actually is shared? But also this idea of taking information from a certain site where it's been intentionally put on that site and using it in another way, which is not intended by the user, and oftentimes not even known by the user that that's a possibility or an option, right? So the question then is, are we allowed to do this? Right? If you are engaging in posting tweets and you know that Twitter is a public domain, right? All tweets are stored in the National Congressional Library. There is no reasonable expectation to privacy in this forum. But does that mean that you can take this information and use it for something else when you didn't give consent and you had no idea that it was going to be used there? Right? And who should be allowed to take this information? Do you think there's a difference between an advertising company? They're certainly not going to be stalking you or using it for the same purposes as the government, maybe to detect fraudulent behavior. They just want to know more about you so that they can send you advertisements for books and for clothes, and there's a sale on at this store. Is that okay? Is there one instance when it's okay and one instance when it's not? What are the limits here? Right? Who would be allowed to take this information if we say that that's allowed. Right, so what are the limits? This idea of data minimization, is this a new idea, or is this something common for everyone? The idea that you only take the minimal amount of data. So let's say I'm a researcher and I want to learn about certain patterns of an individual, and there's a ton of data available on Facebook that I could use, or a ton of data available on Twitter, but I only take that data which is necessary for me to answer my research question. This is the idea of data minimization. And it's a huge problem because oftentimes researchers have all of this data and they say, well, I may as well take it all because I might use it at some point. It could be necessary. I could find all of these correlations. Data mining, right? And then this idea, again, like I mentioned before, the distinction between a value trade-off and balancing of values. This is really important in the ethics domain, to understand the distinction between these two, so that we understand when we hear information in the media about, well, you're just balancing between the two values. Is it really a balance, or are we actually giving up a certain level of privacy, or giving up a certain conception of privacy in order to allow the government or advertising agencies to collect at will? So, part one, the problem and the solution. Is anyone here unfamiliar with the T3 project, the Facebook project, the Taste, Ties, and Time? No, you're not familiar? Okay, so back when Facebook just started, so at the beginning of the century, early 2000s, they were obviously collecting information, as they are today, yeah, but they collected information on a certain cohort, on a certain group of students, and they saved this information. And 4 years after the start, after this group of students had started and finished their program, so 4 years later, so you've left university, you're not hanging out with the same people maybe, or you're in your career, whatnot, they released information about this whole group of students. They de-anonymized, or they anonymized this information, so they didn't release names or information like that, but they released enough details about persons and the courses that they were taking, or their age, or their gender, that you could actually de-anonymize them. So the intention was that this data could be incredibly useful for sociologists to run experiments, to make correlations between students and likes and dislikes, and so they posted it online. This was freely available, and they found out within hours. They hadn't released what university the students were at, but they released enough information that within hours, researchers started to write and say, this is a study group from Harvard, and this is the year that they were students. Within hours. So then Facebook is thinking like, oh crap, what are we going to do? They retract the data, but people had still saved it, so they continued to try and de-anonymize. And within 24 hours, a lot more information was revealed about these individuals. So much so that there was one student from Iran who was actually posting things that had to do with his sexuality, which were problematic for his culture. So then there was issues of discrimination that came into play. So this is the Facebook T3 project, right? And of course, this is just one example of the practices of Facebook. You've probably all heard of recently where Facebook manipulated like 800,000 news feeds. They put either positive or negative messages, right? So they can manipulate your information, but this experiment is noteworthy because people, society started to think, oh geez, what we're putting on Facebook, even though we think that it's private, Facebook can do with it what they want, and it's possible to learn a lot about us as individuals. So then people started to say, okay, didn't you guys go through an institutional review board or an ethics review board? And they did. The ethics review board, the institutional review board of Harvard, said that this was okay. So the conclusion from this and all of the problematic situations that happened afterwards was that we have to have more ethics review boards, and they have to be more sort of integrated with the researchers, and they have to be more up to date with what the technology is actually capable of doing. So this was the proposed solution, yeah? But, oops, now we get to this situation where ethics review boards are suffering from fatigue, right? A lot of the times you're a volunteer to be on this review board. So I'm on the computer science, electrical engineering, and mathematics review board at my university in Twente. And all of these professors, you know, are juggling between all of the lectures and the papers and the grants and the this and the that. And then at some point, you have to find a time when all of us can get together and meet so that we can review all of these research proposals and say yes or no. It's really quite exhausting, first of all, but complicated and difficult to get everyone together. And it's a volunteer basis. You certainly can't pay people to be on the ethics committee because that sort of, you know, makes things a little bit sketchy, yeah? Not only that, but these review boards have a very distinct image for researchers. They're seen as disruptive. In many universities, people just think, oh, it's going to take so much time if I have to go to the review board, and I need to start with my experiments. I need to be interviewing people or sending out my questionnaires next week. And the review board is going to take me an additional 4 weeks or 5 weeks. I don't have the time. This is just, you know, not going to work for me. Or they're seen, so this idea of disruptive, time-consuming, unhelpful. So a lot of times you might get feedback from the ethics review board that just says, nope, you are breaching privacy or you're breaching security in this instance, and that's sort of where it ends, because the review board doesn't have time to go into all of the details and how you might be able to fix it. And this idea that the review board is somewhat useless. And of course, I'm not presenting everyone's views on review boards, but these are some of the strands of thoughts that are common or popular right now, which then minimizes people's willingness to put their research through the review boards, especially if you, in the UK, you have to go through the review board to do research, but in the Netherlands, it's a very different context. It's voluntary right now for the moment. So this solution isn't turning out to be so much of a solution. So now what? Well, when you think of European grant proposals, you have this sort of ethics checklist. And you check the box whether or not you're going to be dealing with personally identifiable information. Are you using animals for your experiments? Is it possible that you could uncover medical information about the patient? So you click, you know, yes or no, and this accomplishes your ethics portion. So for all of you who know the reflexivity that's required for ethics, you have to ask whether or not you can reduce ethics to a checklist, right? It's about much more than just yes, no, yes. It's this consideration of, wait, what am I doing? And what are the consequences, the unintended consequences, the users versus the non-users and the unintended users? This kind of reflection needs to take place, and it can't happen when you actually are doing ethics, or ethics is summed up by a checklist. So then now what? So another potential solution, one that I'm advocating in favor of, is this idea of an ethics advisor. And the ethics advisor is an individual who's trained in ethics to work alongside the researchers. So you become sort of a member of the design team. You have a stake in the research that's happening. This individual is able to identify the ethical issues and the dilemma, so it goes well beyond whether or not you're going to be using animals for experimentation, or whether or not you could have information revealed about individuals, you know, of a medical nature. It goes well beyond that, the relationship between technology and values, that kind of thing. But also, the second point, it allows for space of less transparency. And you might be thinking, oh, what are you talking about, less transparency? That can't be good. But sometimes researchers need to talk to someone about their unclarity or what they might be afraid and worried of, without having someone say, no, you can't do that, that's wrong, that's just bad. They need to understand what it is that they're trying to do and what the potential problems could be. So the ethics advisor, you know, is a counselor of sorts, yeah, comes to talk about them and to hear about the research and to work with them to try and achieve their goals, but maybe using a different technological platform or design method. This idea of the role of the ethicist is not necessarily to be prescriptive, to say you can't do it or you can do it, but to empower, to encourage a reflection on the work of the engineer or the computer scientist, and to allow that individual to come to a decision about, yes, no, I feel comfortable with what I'm doing, or I think I should probably change some of the points of my research. So the role of the ethicist isn't the person to come and shake their finger, but is more of a tool is more of a supportive role to empower the researchers to come to grounds with their decisions. At the same time, the ethics advisor still may be in situations where they do have to be prescriptive and to say, you really shouldn't be doing this. There are way too many severe consequences that you have to take into consideration. So as a disclaimer, of course, there are other solutions that are offered, some technical solutions. The PRIME project, one of the researchers at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, Ronald Leens, is trying to create a software program for identity management so that your computer sort of gives you a warning when you're going to do your online banking or when you're paying with credit card, just to sort of flag, do you know exactly where this information is going, where it is stored, etc. In the bioethics sphere, there's an author right now who's talking about the idea of crowdsourcing to gain more ethics insight, so having everyone sort of give their opinion as a way of engaging in ethical review. And then many researchers right now are talking about the education of engineers, that we need to start when they're in university or even before they get to university about what ethics means and how there are, of course, these different theories, these different normative theories and approaches to ethics, but that it's a discussion, a reflexivity, a capability, right? A practical wisdom, and that these engineers should be encouraged to develop these ethical skills. So those are other solutions, but of course the solution that I'm going to talk about today is my preferred one, which is this idea of the ethics advisor who's hands-on. And an important part to remember is that it maintains a human in the loop. So a lot of times, I was giving a talk at a summer school on identity management, and they were talking about these assistive tools, where you can type in the technology and you can type in what company, what building, what not that you're using, and then this software goes through and assesses whether or not there's going to be problems. And what I found to be remarkable was that the ethics was delegated to a software program, and that really, when we're talking about something like ethics, it's incredibly important to maintain the human in the loop. Not necessarily because the human ethicist has to be responsible for the consequences, but there's so much more that can be gained by having a conversation, making eye contact, allowing you to ask me a question, allowing you to respond to what it is that I've just told, rather than all of that fading to the background and you're plugging in the risk assessment information. So the idea of the ethics advisor is very important to keep the human in the loop, and then all of the other things that I had said before, the space for less transparency, etc.